Hello and welcome to the Lancaster Patriot Podcast, brought to you by futureofchristendom.org. My name is Chris Hume. Thank you so much for joining me once again. Before we get into today's episode, which is about a Supreme Court case that I think you will find very interesting, I want to take a moment to invite you to Future of Christendom's 2025 Fall Conference. This is taking place October 9th, 10th, and 11th here in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Speakers include Jeff Durbin, Eli Ayala, Joel Saint, Luke Saint, Matt Kennitzer, Shaq Corey, and many more. Go to futureofchristendom.org/events. There you will find a link to register for this conference. I encourage you to do so ASAP because I believe we will sell out of tickets for this event. So go check that out right now, futureofchristendom.org/events. And thanks for listening to this episode. If you're watching on YouTube, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Helps us get in front of more people. Well, what I want to do on this episode is cover a recent Supreme Court case. Now, this is a couple months old. The argument took place, I think, back in April or May, or maybe even before, and then the ruling came out a month or two later. But this is the St. Isidore of Seville Catholic Virtual School case. So this is a case about education, forced taxation, and religious liberty, or so some would claim. Now, there's multiple reasons that I encourage people, and I've done this before on the show, to listen to the Supreme Court cases. Number one, there's no better way, in my opinion, to understand the quagmire that is the U.S. legislative system than by listening to these oral arguments in the Supreme Court of the United States. And you can do that on just whatever podcast platform you use, whatever app you use to listen to podcasts. Search Supreme Court oral arguments, and you'll find the recordings of every case, I believe, every case that goes to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court of the United States, obviously you have then higher courts of each state, but the Supreme Courts of the United States, Supreme Court of the United States, I should say, only hears a certain amount of cases each year. So that's a big thing each year. They decide which cases they're going to hear. And then the cases they do hear, there are arguments presented by both sides, and then the justices ask questions. So that's the oral arguments. There's also briefs that are submitted, and then the justices go away for some time. Could be weeks, could be months, and then they come back with their ruling. So if you want to understand the man-made legislative mess in America, I think listening to these Supreme Court arguments is the best way to do that, even more so than reading all the bills and the legislation, because when you hear the justices, quote unquote, these are supposedly the pinnacle of judicial wisdom in America. When you hear them argue these cases, it makes me want to bang my head against the wall, because all they are doing is comparing man-made legislation with a man-made constitution, and never will they go to the law of God as the standard. And I encourage you to listen to Luke Saint's latest episode that he just put out on the Think and Reform podcast, where he talks about Christian nationalism. But I think it's towards the end, around maybe the hour mark, he talks about the reason why we don't have more Christian statesmen. And I think it was in response to a speech that Stephen Wolfe was making, saying, we need to get Christian politicians in there. And of course, theonomists have been arguing for years that, Christians should not be disengaged from the civil realm, but we have to engage based on the law of God. And the reason that there are not more Christian, one of the reasons, and Luke makes this case, go listen to his episode, one of the reasons there are not more Christians in these offices is because the offices are designed for those who hate Christ and do not want to consider his law at all. And when you listen to the Supreme Court cases, you will understand just how much these people are not interested at all in justice in any way. It doesn't matter what's right or wrong. All these people do, and they're paid, I'm sure, heftily. They get a hefty salary based on forced taxation. All they do is argue man-made statutes and legislation versus other man-made statutes and legislation. It doesn't matter what's right or wrong. It doesn't matter what's just. It certainly doesn't matter what God's word says. So if you want to understand the American legislative system and how it works out practically, because this is an argument that I often make, and we make at Future of Christendom, is you have to understand the implications of the system you embrace. God has given us a system of justice in his word. We have chosen a different system, and we often don't think, what are the ramifications of this system? The man-made legislative system leads to the Supreme Court cases where judges are up there and they're beholden to man-made legislation, previous cases. They can never get beyond that. They can't go outside that. All they can do is, and they can try to overturn a previous, court case, which they do sometimes. They say it happens very rarely, but they do. But they always do it by going back to the Constitution. So they're stuck in this system and they can't get beyond that. And so if you want to understand the U.S. legislative system and how it prevents justice, then listen to the Supreme Court cases. The second reason I'll give for listening to the Supreme Court cases is, and this is closely related to the first reason. So the first reason is to understand the man-made legislative system. The second reason is to get one of the best arguments in favor of Lancastrian theonomy or non-legislative theonomy. Listening to these Supreme Court cases, it's obviously not their intention, but it just affirms over and over again what a beautiful system God has given us in the Bible. The system of adjudication and then the standard of his law word. It's a beautiful thing. And when you listen to the Supreme Court cases and the quagmire that we have created for ourselves, it just leaves you desiring the simplicity of God's law, which requires wisdom and prudence to apply, but it does not require this massive bureaucracy and endless reams of legislation that now the Supreme Court justices spend decades arguing over. So I do commend to you listening to the oral arguments of the Supreme Court of the United States, because it will give you a good dose of U.S. civics if you can bear it, and it'll also give you a good encouragement to embrace God's law, theonomy. So with that said, let's jump into this, and I want to first play a brief clip. This is from a news site giving an overview. It's from Fox 23, I believe, giving an overview of this case. And this clip, I think, is from before the oral arguments were made or right after they were made, but before determination was made on this case. So let's listen to this news clip, and then we'll jump into this case. I do have a few clips to play from the oral arguments. I'll make a few comments, and then we'll conclude with kind of making some application here and discuss what the ruling was in this case and what it means. So let's start with this clip.
The U.S. Supreme Court heard oral arguments this morning on the plans for a taxpayer-funded Catholic virtual charter school in Oklahoma. It would be the first of its kind in the nation.
The court now has several weeks to make its decision on if the school is constitutional. Our state is divided on the issue. Fox
23's Devin Lyon is live with the reason both sides feel this decision is critical to Oklahoma's education system.
That's right. There are two very clear sides to this issue, and it all comes down to if the courts believe separation of church and state is supported by the Constitution when it comes to public education.
We believe that our country's promise of the separation of church and state means that our public schools must remain free from religious indoctrination and open to all students.
They don't get to punish people because of their religious beliefs. Taxpayers should decide where their taxpayer dollars go to educate their children.
State leaders, parents, and religious leaders throughout Oklahoma are divided on the case surrounding St. Isidore of Seville Virtual Catholic Charter School.
When taxpayer dollars are used to fund religious charter schools, we blur the vital boundary between church and state.
Wednesday morning, more than a dozen parents and church leaders held a news conference in Tulsa speaking against the charter school.
It opens the door to discrimination against students, families, and educators, and it drains resources from the public schools that need them most.
They presented a statement signed by more than 110 Oklahoma religious leaders who are against any tax dollars going to a religious institution, even if it's educational. They say the charter school would be disastrous for the religious freedom of students.
When the government funds religion, it inevitably tries to regulate it.
Okay, a lot of things there, and I'll mention a few of them. I do agree with this. In our current context, well, in any context, if I want to operate biblically, I would never want money, government money, which is acquired via injustice, forced taxation, to be used to fund the school that I want to be part of or send my children to. So I agree with that, but I don't think those people are arguing against forced taxation in government schools. And that's one of the big problems here. So there's two things to note here as we work up to this case, and we'll listen to some audio in a minute. Two huge things that we already saw in that brief clip. One, forced taxation, and two, religious education. So let me start with the second one. The claim being made, and you saw there on that screen, it said public schools are not Sunday schools. Well, that's a bit ironic because it was, I don't know if it was Horace Mann, it might have been Dewey that came later, but the architects of the American educational system, they intentionally wanted to supplant the Sunday school Christian education with the government education. And the idea that it could ever be neutral was a pipe dream. And that's something that has been sold to Christians, and Christians have bought it and said, oh yeah, well, the government education, the public education is neutral, and we don't want the government involved in religious education because that violates separation of church and state, which of course that claim is nonsense. But do you see what they're making there? It's a bait and switch. It's the classic case of the non-Christian claiming neutrality when there is no such thing in any realm of life, certainly not in education. You cannot have a neutral education. Education teaches people right and wrong, truth and falsehood, teaches morality. Education is inescapably religious. And so the very fact that these people are positing this as a question of should the government be involved in religious education or just neutral education should be a non-starter to the thinking Christian. There is no such thing as a neutral education or a non-religious education. All education is religious. That's the first huge elephant in the room, that the fact that these people are naive to that is very concerning. Of course, if you're listening to this, you're very aware of that. And most of you probably, for that reason, have pulled your children out of the government schools because you understand they are not neutral. They are actively opposed to the lordship of Jesus Christ. The other thing that came up, and will come up again in these clips, is taxation. And again, this is central. Without forced taxation, all of this is a moot point. There are so many things that if we followed the biblical model for taxation, which I still challenge anyone to come on this podcast via Zoom and distance or in person and have a debate on, does the law of God authorize the magistrate to punish you if you do not pay your taxes to the magistrate? I challenge anyone to debate that who will argue and say, from the Bible, the magistrate is authorized to basically take your money at gunpoint or sword point if you haven't paid your tax. But forced taxation lies at the heart of this. If we had the biblical model of voluntary taxation, this would be a moot point because then the government could not be involved in this attempted monopoly on education. So we'll come back to these two things, forced taxation and religious education. Keep those things in mind. Those are central to this whole case. So what's going on with this case? Let me give a brief overview here. First of all, the school in question is a charter school. So a charter school, and this is from the Oklahoma government website, says charter schools are public schools that are allowed greater flexibility for greater accountability. So they are classifying charter schools as public schools. And so, of course, I think you can sense what's coming next. The argument is going to be, well, if the charter school is a public school, we know here in America, separation of church and state, all the government schools are neutral. They're non-religious. They're non-sectarian, is a phrase you'll hear here. So therefore, this charter school is a Roman Catholic school. It cannot be a charter school. It can't be a public, because charter schools are public schools. We have to reject the petition from this school to be accepted as a charter school. And so let me read here just the background to this case. This is a case in which the court will decide, one, whether a privately owned and operated school's educational decisions are considered state action simply because the school has a contract with the state to provide free education to students. Okay, and this is from, I believe, OYE's website. Maybe I'll put this on the screen if I can find it. So the first question, is what the school does considered state action because it's a public school? Number two, whether the First Amendment's free exercise clause prohibits or the Establishment Clause requires a state to exclude religious schools from its charter school program. So, and if you listen to the whole case, you'll hear those two things brought up, a positive and a negative. So from the First Amendment, the free exercise of religion, does that prohibit the state from excluding the religious school from its charter school program? In other words, The argument that the school is making, the Catholic school, is saying, hey, First Amendment, you can't discriminate against us because of our religion. Even though we're applying to be a public school, you can't say the reason we're not letting you be this charter public school is because of your religion. That violates the First Amendment. On the other hand, the other side will argue, well, actually, the Establishment Clause, which prohibits the establishment of religion, that actually would require the state to exclude all religious schools from the charter school program. Again, if you remember what we just talked about with the idea of a religiously neutral education being a lie, but that is assumed here. It is assumed that there can be a religiously neutral education. And so now from the get-go, the argument is completely useless because you're operating on the wrong foundation. You're operating on the foundation that doesn't exist, this idea of neutrality. And so now and when Christians buy into this, you're going to lose. Because if you accept the idea that, hey, there's religious education and non-religious education, and now we're going to debate whether or not the government should fund religious education, you've lost. Because the government is funding religious education right now. They're teaching children that it's okay to murder babies if you have sex and don't want a child. They're teaching children that it's okay to change your gender. They're teaching children that marriage can be between two men. They're teaching religion, and they're doing so under the guise of being neutral. And it is a bait and switch. It is a classic case of the unbeliever standing on the foundation of Christianity and then denying it and then getting Christians to accept their faulty foundation. So that's kind of the foundation for this argument. So this guy, Gentler Drummond, the Attorney General for the state of Oklahoma, filed an action against the Oklahoma Statewide Virtual Charter School Board and its members seeking to invalidate their contract with St. Isidore of Seville Catholic Virtual School. St. Isidore, supported by the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City and the Diocese of Tulsa, aims to operate as a Catholic virtual charter school. In creating this contract, the Charter School Board recognized religious rights and entitlements for St. Isidore, which deviated from the standard expectation that charter schools remain non-sectarian under Oklahoma law. Okay, so the school wants to operate as a government charter school, which there's probably a lot of complications to it, as there is with anything with this man-made legislation and government involvement in it. But essentially, they get taxpayer money, of course. They're going to get funding from the state, and they have to offer free education, quote unquote, so anybody can send their child there. So in that sense, it's a public school, but yet they can still operate based on their religious convictions. Let me continue on here. On June 5th and June 9th of 2023, the Charter School Board approvingly voted for St. Isidore's application and contract, both by a 3-2 margin. The contract omitted standard provisions prohibiting religious affiliation while affirming St. Isidore's religious mission, which the state contends violates the Oklahoma Constitution, the Oklahoma Charter Schools Act, and the Establishment Clause of the federal Constitution. So again, you can see here, the arguments being made against this school are that they're violating man-made Oklahoma Constitution, man-made Oklahoma Charter Schools Act, and the man-made Establishment Clause of the federal Constitution. Nowhere, of course, will you hear any reference to biblical law or the Bible or even Christian principles. That's how far we are removed from justice. And that's what happens when you set up as your foundation the man-made legislative system and the three branches of government. This is what you get. You get people sit in robes sitting in the Supreme Court building, arguing about, pitting man's wisdom against man's wisdom. It is the height of folly, and it's no wonder that our country is in the state that it's in. Let's go on here and say, the Supreme Court of Oklahoma assumed original jurisdiction and granted belated relief to the state, holding, this is important, holding that the contract violated state and federal law, okay, violates our man-made law, including constitutional provisions prohibiting government establishment of religion. So the state of Oklahoma said, no, we're putting a quash on this. This Catholic school cannot be a charter school because that's a public school. It can't be a public school. This can be a private school, but you're not getting state funds because we are not going to be involved in the establishment of a religion. The school appeals, or the charter board, I'm not sure who made the appeal here. I have to look it up here. Looks like it's St. Isidore. No, it's the Charter School Board, which I'm sure included, St. Isidore leadership. But let's just keep it simple and say the Catholic school, the charter school, appeals and says, no, we do have a right to be a government school, and we want this to go to the Supreme Court of the United States. And so that's what happened. So let's listen to a few clips, just a couple clips. And then if you don't know how the Supreme Court ruled, I will tell you here after discussing these clips briefly. But again, we are so buried in statism that it's not even funny, because the idea of having to argue about this, we're already layers deep in forced taxation. And then we have to argue about whether or not it's, having a religious school would violate the Constitution or the Oklahoma charter school law. We're other layers deep in state. There's no way to get to justice when the law of God is abandoned and you place these things as the standard. But let's take a listen here. And if you've never listened to the Supreme Court arguments, this might give you a taste of just how pathetic and useless they are. So here we go. This is the opening statement of Gregory Garr. He's arguing for the state of Oklahoma against the Catholic school, if I am not mistaken. Let's take a listen.
Teaching religion as truth in public schools is not allowed. St. Isidore has made clear that that's exactly what it wants to do in infusing its school day with the teachings of Jesus Christ. Oklahoma respects and promotes through vouchers and other means the abilities of families to secure such an education in a private school. But this court has held in a series of landmark precedents, not challenged by anyone here, that the Establishment Clause bars such devotional teaching in public schools. And third, petitioners are not seeking access to Oklahoma's program on equals terms. They seek a special status, the right to establish a religious charter school, plus an exemption from the non-discrimination requirements that apply to every other charter school and that distinguish public schools from private schools. The charter school movement is one of the modern-day success stories of public education. Presidents, governors, and legislators from across the country have recognized that charter schools have improved educational opportunities and outcomes for millions of Americans, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, within the public school system. A ruling for petitioners would not only lead to the creation of the nation's first religious public school, it would render unconstitutional, as my friend from the Solicitor General acknowledged, the federal charter school program and immediately the laws of 47 states across this country. And it would result in the astounding rule that states not only may, but must fund and create public religious schools, an astounding reversal from this court's time-honored precedents. I welcome the court's questions.
Okay, again, just to reiterate, he's saying, this would be the first religious public school in America. Obviously, that's completely untrue. Every single public school that exists right now is a religious school. He said there'd be special exemptions here. So he's painting this picture that, none of the other schools are allowed to teach religion, but St. Isidore wants the exemption to be able to teach the religion of Jesus Christ, Christian religion as truth. And he said, and I quote here, teaching religion as truth is not allowed. That's what he said. It's not allowed in the government schools. Teaching religion as truth is not allowed. And if you had any of these justices, if you had a Christian in there, we're asking for Christians and Christian nationalists want to get their guy in office. If they put forward, would they want a Supreme Court justice who would say, you know what? I understand that we have the Constitution and the state law, but there's a higher law, and that's God's law. That's what it would mean for a Christian statesman to interact with this stuff. To say that God's law is supreme. That's the whole point of bringing Christianity into the public square. It's to bring the claims of Christ and the law word of God into conflict with man's claims. And it just seems like a lot of people flying under the banner, perhaps, of Christian nationalism really want more of the same. Well, no, let's get in there and try to argue from the Constitution that we can have Christian schools. I think it's a fool's errand. And anyway, here you have this guy saying, look, we don't have any other religious government schools out there. This can't be the first one. So obviously, that is not true. Every school is religious because every school teaches something as truth. It teaches a worldview. It teaches morality. And you cannot be neutral on Jesus Christ. It teaches something about Jesus Christ. So just a complete falsehood there. I just wanted to play that clip just to emphasize what I was saying regarding the neutral claim that does not exist. There's no neutrality. All right, but now I want you to listen to this. This is Sonia Sotomayor, the Supreme Court Justice, and she's going to get us into the taxation. Listen to how she talks about this case and her argument as it relates to forced taxation.
Counsel, there's been private education, and you're right, there's been free private education to a variety of different groups, but none of them are government supported. Meaning they were using government money to do this. They were using donations or whatever sources of income they could find. The hallmark of public education is that taxpayers are paying for it, not private donations. The government's doing this. And that has never been something that other people did for the government, meaning charter schools are a creation of contract, which is the point that Justice Alito made, which is charter schools are using only government funds. And so the question is not whether it's a government agency, but whether it's a state actor.
Well, she does get right to the heart of the matter in saying, look, the real issue here is the government money. And it's interesting, she goes back and forth because, well, it's the taxpayer money and then it becomes the government money, and the government is in charge of it now. The government doesn't produce, well, they print the money, but they don't produce wealth. They don't labor. They take money from the people, or they print more money, thus debasing the currency of the people. And so she says the hallmark of government or public education is taxpayers are paying for it. That's absolutely right. They're paying for it against their will. Their money is being stolen from them, and it's being used by the government now to operate the education system. And the idea that, well, because these are government workers, they're going to be neutral is just asinine. Everybody brings their ultimate authority to everything they do, especially education. And so the idea that, well, since it's government money and since the government's running it, it's going to be neutral is just ridiculous. But she is correct that this is the heart of the matter. This is about government. This is about the money that we steal from you, and we are not going to let you tell us how to use the money that we steal from you. I mean, that's the bottom line. And that's why the whole idea here that it's just a waste of energy, and I'm sure there's probably some Christian groups behind this. I'm not sure which ones that are set. This is an important case. We need to win because this gives us religious freedom, or this gives us the ability to bring Christianity into the government school realm, and let's take back the government schools. I bet you there would be some Christian nationalists out there arguing and saying, this is exactly what we need. We just need to get a different Supreme Court justice up there so that cases like this will go in our favor, and the government schools, the money that's stolen from everybody, can be used for Roman Catholic schools. We're completely missing the point. But she is absolutely correct that the heart of it all is the money that is stolen from the people, and that the government now claims as their own and wants to use to achieve. Does anyone think that the government is like, you know what, we're just so benevolent and we just care so much about the children that we want them to have an education that is going to serve them the best? Of course not. The government agents that are involved in this, because it's people, it's not like there's government out there that's this, inanimate thing. It's people who are in control of that system, who are controlling it to benefit them. They want to create compliant servants of the state who will give them more and more taxpayer money, never question it, and continue to be dependent upon the nanny state. The government is not in the position to provide education for the children of a nation. And the sooner we recognize that, the better. But Justice Sotomayor is absolutely correct. And I mentioned those two things, taxation and religious education. And the taxation, it just comes up again and again, is at the heart of all this. You're not going to get justice if you do not deal with some foundational things, one of them being the idea that the magistrate is authorized to steal money from people for basically any reason. I mean, the government can just come up with a law and say, you know what, we want to do this, and therefore we're going to take your money. It is the very definition of slavery. It's just now very sanitized and there's an illusion of freedom, but you still have your taskmaster over you saying, I demand this labor from you or else I'm going to lock you up. I don't know how that's any different than slavery. So one more clip here, and then I'll let you know how this case ended up. So you might get an idea of how it's going. Now, I'll tell you this. There's 9 Supreme Court justices. Justice Barrett, Amy Barrett, recused herself from this case, I think because she had ties to Notre Dame or something. So there's only 8 justices voting on this here. So let's listen to the final clip. This is Ketanji Brown Jackson, infamous for not being able to define what a woman is. Let's listen to her wisdom on this case. And she's arguing with someone here, D. John Sauer. I think this guy is arguing for the Roman Catholic Charter School.
So are you saying that the religious charter schools' use of public funds to support proselytization, which the school says it intends to do, is not an Establishment Clause problem? Like, we wouldn't have to look at like where the funding is going. Even if the school says, yes, we're getting money from the state and we are turning around and buying Bibles and instructing the students and make, no Establishment Clause problem.
The principle of genuine and independent private choice that goes from Zellman to Carson would address that directly. Here, the parents are choosing with open eyes to take their kid to the religious charter school. They're understanding we may be subject to proselytization or whatever it would be.
So you're saying the Establishment Clause only does work in a situation in which a person is being forced to engage in religious activities if there's a choice somehow?
No, I'm saying where state funding is going through to religious schools on an even footing through where public and private schools can apply for the funding, as you see here. And in addition to that, the decision whether or not to go to the religious school or the non-religious school lies in the hands of the parents. That is genuine, independent, private choice, which I don't think is disputed in this case, and therefore that would not violate the Establishment Clause. Okay. Once that's the position, then...
Yeah. And one final question.
All right, that's some of the stupidest things I've ever heard. This is totally pointless because in the end, none of this has anything to do with biblical justice, Christian principles, anything, or even with the history of America. Nothing. It's complete ignorance of what justice is. It's a complete embrace by both sides, an embracing of the statist system. And as long as you do that, you will not outstate the statists. And there are many Christian nationalists out there who want to say, we can outstate the statists, we can out-legislate the pagan statists, let's get our legislation in there. And they're missing the point because the system itself creates these ever-constricting circles that you become trapped. And you hear the guy argument, well, Carson versus Macon and this and that. And that's your arsenal. That's what you're bringing before the magistrates. You're going to go before the kings and princes, and you're going to speak what? Carson versus Macon? You're going to, the U.S. Constitution? No. You go before the kings and the magistrates, and you proclaim God's testimonies. And you do that consistently, and God blesses that. There will be no blessing from this, regardless of how this case turns out. So if you don't know yet, I'll tell you in a minute. But whether or not the justices say, you know what? This is allowed. This Roman Catholic school, we can, the money that is stolen from the people can be used to fund this Roman Catholic school. Or if they say, no, the money that's stolen from the people can't be used for this Roman Catholic school because that's the establishment of religion. In either case, it's not a win. Justice is perverted in either case because we are so far from even asking the right questions. We're not even asking the right questions. And that's why these Supreme Court arguments are so maddening, because these are supposedly the brightest judicial minds in America, and they can't even ask the right questions about any of this stuff. They are either incredibly dull or I don't know. I mean, obviously, they're not interested in biblical law. And the sad thing is there are many Christian voices out there that would praise, we got our Supreme Court appointee by Trump, and that's great, and that's what we need more of, and we get one more, and it's going to turn things around. These justices don't even know what questions to ask. They don't they're so buried in statism after years and years and years of being taught by these statist law schools and serving as lawyers. I mean, most of them, right? You become a lawyer and then you become a judge. I mean, they're so brainwashed in that they can't even step outside it for a moment. And even when they're arguing for what might seem like a good thing, it's still so buried in statism that justice is nowhere to be found. There's a lot more clips I could play there, but that gives you an idea. So they heard these arguments. That was April 30th. They came back and had a decision, I think it was maybe a month later. And so let me read this. This is from SCOTUSblog.com. Amy Howe writes this. She said, so here's our ruling. The Supreme Court on Thursday morning left in place a ruling by the Oklahoma Supreme Court rejecting an effort by a Catholic virtual charter school to become the country's first religious charter school. In an unsigned one-sentence order, the justices indicated that, with Justice Amy Coney Barrett recused from the case, they had divided 4-4. The order did not indicate how any of the justices voted. That tie means the state Supreme Court's opinion remains good law, although it is binding only in Oklahoma and does not have nationwide effect. So it was a tie, and therefore that means that the state of Oklahoma's ruling stands, which was we will not fund this Roman Catholic charter virtual school, which means that I forget who it was here. Who's the name of the judge that they think defected? Now I can't find it, and I'm forgetting his name. But apparently there was one supposedly conservative judge that may have, it was, if you just did straight conservative versus liberals, it might have been 5-3. And they're speculating that he was the one that switched sides. I don't really know. Let's see here. Anyway, so there was a split 4-4. So this will not be the first religious government school. Obviously, we have thousands of government religious schools already. And this is this is from nondoc.com, an article, and it's going to talk about, there's going to be a quote here from Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond, his name is on the case, Oklahoma Charter Schools versus Drummond. So he won, and he's very excited about that. So nondoc.com says, Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond, who filed the challenge against the proposed school, celebrated the decision. Quote, the Supreme Court's decision represents a resounding victory for religious freedom and for the foundational principles that have guided our nation since its founding, Drummond said in a statement. This ruling ensures that Oklahoma taxpayers will not be forced to fund radical Islamic schools while protecting the religious rights of families to choose any school they wish for their children, end quote. That's a pretty, that's some PR right there. And I think, this is feeding on the fear of people, like if we allow this, then this is going to happen. So we need the government. This is the classic case of the government creating a problem and then offering, more government intervention as a solution. So the problem here is, well, what if taxpayers are forced to fund radical Islamic schools? Oh no. Well, first of all, what would be wrong with that? What if it's a non-religious Islamic school? What if they just teach that it's okay to go around and murder people because of evolution? Now it's not religion, right? It's just science. So again, there's so many layers of inconsistencies here, but it's presented as this boogeyman. Well, you wouldn't want the money that we steal from you to go to Islamic schools, would you? So this is actually about religious freedom, because you need to be free to know that the money we steal from you isn't going to religious indoctrination. That's what religious liberty is all about. Don't you know that, you stupid American? If you're in favor of this Roman Catholic school getting taxpayer money, you're opposed to religious freedom. And now we're going to be funding radical Islamic schools, which, quite frankly, couldn't be much worse than the government school system we have now, which teaches us to murder our offspring and commit sexual perversion for no good reason, no religious reason. Just do it because. At least with the religion, they have some reason for doing their atrocities. I'm not promoting Islamic schools, obviously, but it's kind of like that, when people look back and say, oh man, it was so brutal in the past and the Crusades, and these people were killing people over religion, how horrible. And we could get into that whole thing. But It's much better now because now we kill people for no reason, right? We murder them. We murder babies because it's inconvenient. Can you believe people in the past used to fight people because they had like things they really believed in? Now we just slaughter our innocents because it's inconvenient. We've advanced so much. So there's the Supreme Court's ruling. There you go. Our highest judicial minds are once again steering this country in a good direction. And again, regardless of the outcome, it doesn't matter. I really don't care which direction this case goes because it's neither direction is getting us closer to justice. It's just tightening the ratchet, tightening the screw on the statist system. And that's why if you listen to the Supreme Court cases, you will quickly become disabused of the idea that, we just got to get the right justice in there and that'll change things. The entire system needs to collapse because it's built on the sinking sand of man's wisdom, which is man's folly. And this idea that we can legislate better than God, it's insane. So there's your Supreme Court case, the St. Isidore case, the Oklahoma charter schools versus Drummond, and Drummond wins. Oklahoma State wins. This Roman Catholic school will be funded by other means other than the money stolen from Oklahoma citizens by their benevolent nanny state. Well, there's much more that could be said, but that gives you an idea. Now, if anybody asks you about the St. Isidore case, you can tell them, yes, that was the case when the Supreme Court justices disagreed about how the money that is stolen from Oklahoma citizens should be used. One side said, it's okay to use that money for a Roman Catholic school. The other side said, no, we only want to use it for the religious schools that we like, namely the ones that teach secular humanism. So both sides are completely oblivious to true justice. All right, well, let me know if there's another case you want me to briefly touch on, and I'll be happy to. I don't know if I'll be happy to listen to it because it's very painful to listen to the Supreme Court justices. It is so painful. And again, I can't not think of a better argument in favor of theonomy than listening to the Supreme Court cases because it just shows the utter folly and uselessness of the man-made legislative system. It shows us how far it has taken us from justice. And the sad thing is that most Americans are taught, and many Christians are taught, that this is the best system in the world, the three branches of government, the legislative branch and the Supreme Court. I mean, this is great. And this is why we have such freedom we have in America. We have those freedoms, and they're fast dwindling. Whatever we have left is in spite of this system and not because of it. And that is the textbook case of a people being blessed by God and then saying, hey, the reason we're blessed is because of our might, because of our wisdom, because of our insight. This is exactly what God told the Israelites. When you go in the promised land and I give you this land flowing with milk and honey and I drive out the inhabitants before you, do not say, once things are going well, that this is because of our strength and our wisdom. Do not do that because it won't go well for you. And that's exactly what America has done. But most American Christians miss this point. We do that when we lean on the Constitution and the three branches of government that we are taught as a religion from our youth in the government schools, that this is the greatest system ever devised by man. And it's the reason we have such freedom. It is not the reason we have such freedom. And if you actually study it and you listen to the Supreme Court cases as one example, you will see how the very system that is praised in the government schools is taking away our freedoms and taking us farther from justice little by little. Every case that happens takes us further from justice. And it's a perfect example of man praising his own wisdom and rejecting God's wisdom revealed in the law word of God. So thank you for listening. For more information about the Lancaster Patriot, you can just go to futureofchristendom.org. You'll find all our podcasts there. You'll find Luke's podcast, Matt's podcast, Joel's podcasts. If you want to support this podcast, go to patreon.com/Lancaster Patriot. And once again, I exhort you to sign up for Future of Christendom's October conference held here in Lancaster County. Go to futureofchristendom.org, click on the events tab, go to the registration link, get signed up for that. It's going to be a great conference. A lot of time for fellowship. That's one thing we really try to focus on, having a lot of time for fellowship and interaction. There's going to be a dinner. Add that as an add-on when you register. It'll be a great time of fellowship and interaction. So thank you for listening. Until next time, remember that Christ, not the Supreme Court, is king. So long.